Tolkien, one of the most knowledgeable Old English scholars ever, spent most of his life teaching university students. He taught general medieval English courses at the University of Leeds for 5 years in the early 1920s, before moving to Oxford and teaching Old English as the Rawlinson and Bosworth Professor of Anglo-Saxon at Pembroke College. In 1945, he moved over to Merton and became the Merton Professor of English Language and Literature. From that point onward, he mostly taught Middle English. But what was he reading with his students? Happily, we have university records that answer that very question, and today I'd like to put you in the shoes of an Oxford undergraduate in the 1930s, learning Old English from the professor in his prime, and reading the texts that he thought were quintessential to understanding the Anglo-Saxons. In this video, I'll cover the poems and selections that Tolkien most frequently lectured on, talking about their significance, how to read them, and, to the best of our ability, how we can understand them from his perspective. Stay tuned. Number 1. Beowulf. There's so much to say about Tolkien's relationship with Beowulf, so I'll try to keep it brief. This is the poem that Tolkien taught most frequently while at Pembroke, and also without a doubt the single most important work of any kind to understanding him. I had a professor once say, if you want to understand The Lord of the Rings, you ought to study Beowulf, and if you want to understand Beowulf, you ought to study The Lord of the Rings. In terms of influence on Tolkien's art and philosophy, the subject of his scholarly attention, and also really just what he liked to read, everything else is secondary to Beowulf. Except maybe the Bible. Luckily, we have a very good idea of what reading Beowulf with Tolkien must have been like, because his lecture notes and translation were published together about a decade ago in this book. If you don't already have it, I can't recommend it enough. It is an absolute essential to studying Beowulf or Tolkien, and the lecture notes at the end especially are simply fascinating. The translation is not good. Tolkien was still pretty young and inexperienced when he wrote it, and several decades later, when he was the masterful scholar of Old English that we know him as now, he was very unhappy with it. It is nonetheless very interesting to see what young Tolkien thought about the poem by reading his translation. I'll offer you two better translations as an alternative. My favorite is by Tom Shippey, who is simultaneously one of the best Beowulf scholars ever and one of the best Tolkien scholars ever. What's especially interesting about this edition is not only is the translation amazing, not only is it replete with commentary by Leonard Neidorff, who is also a phenomenal Beowulf scholar, but the appendix has a really interesting essay by Shippey on Tolkien's relationship with Beowulf, which I really think adds to the value of the book. Tolkien's students would have been reading Beowulf in Kleber's edition, which was updated not too long ago. The Shippey translation is facing page, meaning it has the Old English on the left side, and it uses almost the exact same text as the Kleber with a few minor improvements, so I really don't recommend buying the Kleber unless you are seriously invested in Beowulf scholarship. If you already have the Shippey Beowulf and you want another recommendation, I also like R.D. Fulk's translation of Beowulf that he did for the Dumbarton Oaks Medieval Library. Fulk is a great scholar. He contributed a lot to the modern Kleber edition, and he was once praised by Shippey as being the successor to Tolkien. In Old English studies, there's really not much higher praise than that. Number 2. Waldere. Waldere is one of many fragmentary poems in this list, and gives a few snippets of a now mostly lost epic concerning Walter of Aquitaine, a legendary hero who appears in many stories. In his own story, he has to fight his friend Hagen and the wicked king Gunther, both of whom appear in other stories like the Nibelungenlied and the Poetic Edda, in order to defend his treasure and his bride-to-be, Hildegund. Tolkien was mesmerized by fragmentary things, and scholars such as Verlyn Flieger and Peter Grabowskis have made the compelling point that he might have intentionally left his own legendarium, as partly fragmentary, as a sort of artistic device. A good deal of what Tolkien would have taught in lectures on Waldere would have been other poems in other languages, which tell the story more fully. Leonard Neidorff and Brian Murdoch have recently published an edition that covers the figure of Walter of Aquitaine extensively, and I can't recommend a better book for trying to recreate for yourself what Tolkien would have taught in lecture. If you're really interested in Walter's story, you might also enjoy this new edition of the Latin epic poem Waltharius, published by the same two men. Tolkien knew the Waltharius well and almost certainly covered it in class. The Old English Waldere fragments themselves can be found with the text and translation in the appendices of the Shippey Beowulf, and you can also find the Old English text annotated online at Peter Baker's Old English Anthology website. As with everything I mention in this video, I'll have all the links in the description. Number 3. The Finnsburg Fragment. This was one of the most fascinating pieces of Old English poetry for Tolkien, and he wrote about it extensively. The Finnsburg Fragment tells us about the beginning of a battle, which is part of a story commonly referred to as the Disaster at Finnsburg or the Finnsburg Saga, wherein a bunch of Danish princes staying at the Frisian court are ambushed by a bunch of Jutes who are also guests there. I cover this story in my recent video about Waldere, so if you'd like to learn more, I would recommend checking that out. It's truly one of the most compelling stories in the Germanic canon. We have Tolkien's lecture notes on this saga and a translation published in a book called Finn and Hengist. It's sometimes difficult to understand what he's saying, but Tom Shippey draws out the entire affair in a really helpful way with genealogies and timelines in his recent book, Beowulf and the North Before the Vikings. If you don't want to buy a whole new book, I should say that the Finnsburg Fragment is also included at the end of the Shippey Beowulf, and you can find the Old English text annotated online in the same Peter Baker website in the description. Number 4. Deor. This is one of the saddest and most depressing poems in Old English, but it's also an absolute goldmine for Germanic mythology, and an extremely valuable reference for a lot of our stories. Tolkien loved good poetry per se, but I think this latter point is absolutely the reason why he decided to teach the poem at Oxford. I have a whole video dedicated to the poem Deor, and I do believe that most of what Tolkien would have taught is actually covered there, so I won't go into it more here. If you'd like a physical translation, you can find the poem translated in the Penguin First Poems in English edition, which also has the Finnsburg Fragment and a couple other items on this list. For students of Old English, the current scholarly edition of the text can be found in R.D. Folk's 8 Old English poems, with extensive notes and commentary. Number 5. Volundarkviða. The next few poems are actually not Old English, they're Old Icelandic in the Poetic Edda. Tolkien taught a lot of Old Icelandic poems, but in particular he taught the Vålundarkviða next to Deor, as they both mention the famous smith Weland, who is the inspiration for Tolkien's Fëanor. I tell Weland's story in the aforementioned Deor video, but while Deor only alludes to the story, the Vålundarkviða tells it with much more detail. All of the Norse material I'm about to mention can be found in Jackson Crawford's excellent new edition of the Poetic Edda, which I highly recommend. If you're looking for a cheaper and thinner book, I would also recommend Caroline Larrington's edition with Oxford World Classics. These are both purely English translations. If you're interested in the Old Norse text, you can find a facing page translation of the full Edda online at the website voluspa.org, which is named after the first work in the Edda. Number 6. Voluspa. The Voluspa is the Old Norse creation story and the beginning point for Norse mythology in general. That alone should explain why Tolkien found it interesting, but if you need proof, you should look no further than the fact that it lists a few conspicuously named dwarves, such as Thorin, Thrain, Fili, Kili, Ori, Dori, Nori, Beaver, Bofer, Bomber, and even Gandalf. Now where have I heard those names before? There has been loads written on the influence of Norse mythology on Tolkien's Legendarium, but if you'd like to challenge yourself, I would recommend reading the Voluspa and then comparing it with the beginning of the Silmarillion. If you have access to the History of Middle-earth series, this exercise becomes even more interesting when you compare the Voluspa to the early versions of the Ainulindale and the Quenta Silmarillion. As with the Volundarkviða, I recommend Crawford or Larrington's translations, but you can find the text for free online. Number 7. Atlakviða. Less mythological and more rooted in some actual semblance of real history, the Atlakviða is the oldest poem in the Poetic Edda, and gives us an early version of the story that we get at the end of the Nibelungenlied. That is, where Attila and the Queen of the Huns, here named Gudrun, invite the Burgundians over for dinner, and then, upon receiving them, kill them all. In Atlakviða, Gudrun then also kills her husband Attila and burns the palace to the ground. Her motivation is revenge for the death of her star-crossed lover, Sigurd. Tolkien loved this story, and 2 of his attempts to tell it are published together in the book Sigurd and Gudrun, together with commentary and notes by Christopher Tolkien. If we want to understand what Tolkien thought about the Atlakviða, this book is a great place to start. Not in the least bit because Tolkien actually began to translate the Atlakviða into Old English, which Christopher Tolkien includes in the appendices. Of course, the story itself can also be found in the Crawford and Larrington translations, as well as online, as with the other Eddic poems. Number 8. The Battle of Brunanburh. Coming back to Old English, the poem that we call the Battle of Brunanburh is a mid-10th century telling of a famous battle where the English king Athelstan defeated a combined army of Scottish, Irish, and Viking invaders. Tolkien taught this poem frequently at Oxford, and he notably translated the last few lines into alliterative verse in an effort to demonstrate Old English meter to a modern audience. No greater host of folk hath fallen before this day in this island ever by the edge of swords and battle slaughtered, as books tell us and ancient authors. since from the east hither Saxon and English from the sea landed, over the broad billows Britain assailing, the Welsh smiting on war's anvil, glory seeking great men of old, in this land winning a lasting home. Most of the poem's popularity comes from the fact that it seems to be one of the first examples of English patriotism. It's not the King of Wessex or the army of Mercia, but the King of England and the English army, which defeat the invaders from overseas. In the late 1930s, as Tolkien and his students were staring down the barrel at Nazi Germany, I think this poem would have had particular emotional strength, and it's not surprising to me that he chose it for his translation, which he read on radio in 1938. You can find a full translation in the Penguin book I mentioned earlier, and the current scholarly edition of the actual text is in Fulk's 8 Old English Poems. Number 9. The Battle of Maldon. The Battle of Maldon is a similar poem on a much larger scale, though we don't really know how large because we only have what is probably the middle third. This middle third tells the heroic but tragic failed defense of the shores at Maldon by the famous alderman Byrhtnoth, who had his head hewn off by the invading Vikings. Tolkien loved the Battle of Maldon poem, and he wrote about it frequently. Not only did he write a full translation, he also wrote a play in alliterative verse about the aftermath of the battle and the creation of the poem itself. Peter Grabowskis, who was actually one of my advisors in undergrad, published this excellent edition, which covers all of Tolkien's work on Maldon. Being a popular poem, it's not very difficult to find editions and translations, and the Penguin book I mentioned has a full translation, while the Fulk book I mentioned has the current scholarly text, which you can also find online at Peter Baker's website. Dumbarton Oaks also has a facing page translation of the poem in their edition of the Old English Chronicle. Number 10. The Dream of the Rood. When Christianity came to the pagan Anglo-Saxons around the year AD 600, it spread with remarkable speed, and the full conversion of England really only took about 80 years, with minimal resistance and no martyrs. One of the ideas we float around for why this conversion was so successful compared to other efforts in the Germanic world is that in this instance, the figure of Christ was dressed up as very masculine and heroic. One of the most explicit examples of this is the poem that we call The Dream of the Rood, which narrates the crucifixion, calling Christ Jung Haleth, which means young hero, talks about how he manfully climbs up the cross, and the whole thing is narrated from the perspective of the tree that the cross was carved from. Tolkien and his contemporaries actually called this poem The Vision of the Cross, but modern editions prefer the title The Dream of the Rood to mirror the Old English word rood, which means tree, and also cross, that's found in the poem itself. Some scholars argue that Tolkien's obsession with trees has its roots in the Dream of the Rood poem, but I think that's a bit dubious. Most likely Tolkien would have appreciated it for its poetic merit and what it tells us about the society it emerged from. This poem, like the Battle of Maldon, can be found translated in the Penguin book, annotated in the Fulk book, and online in the Peter Baker website. Number 11. Judith. This is a poetic retelling of the story of Judith, one of the books in the Bible that most Protestant denominations consider apocryphal, but to the early medieval English would have been considered valid. Judith's city is under siege by the invading Assyrian general Holofernes, and she has the idea to go to his camp under the guise of offering him intelligence. Holofernes gets very drunk and falls head over heels in love with her, but as he tries to sleep with her, she cuts his head off and sneaks off with it. The next day, the Assyrian army discovers the scene and collapses in panic. The city is saved. It's theorized that the Anglo-Saxons liked the character of Judith so much because she reminded them of women like Gudrun, carefully and cleverly plotting the murder of an unsuspecting enemy king. Old English evangelists probably jumped at the opportunity to tell a legendary story about a biblical figure that they knew would be appealing to contemporary audiences. This poem, which is also fragmentary, is one of the most common works that Tolkien taught while he was at Pembroke. He was particularly fascinated by a phrase that the poet used to describe Judith, Edis Alf Shinu, which literally means woman elf bright, or lady elven fair. That last element, Shinu, is where we get the word sheen from, but it's cognate with German schön and means beautiful in early English. Tolkien wrote a whole song in Old English called Edis Alf Shinu, which I perform here if you're interested, and in early drafts of The Lord of the Rings, he flirted with the idea of calling Éowyn Elfsheen as a nod to this word. He was clearly intrigued by the idea of what it meant to be elven fair, and he probably spent more time thinking about this than the actual poem itself, which is pretty typical for Tolkien. You can read Judith in a good facing page translation in R.D. Fulk's Beowulf translation, which contains the entire contents of the Beowulf manuscript. If you're only interested in the Old English text, you can find that online on Peter Baker's website. Number 12. Exodus. The Exodus poem is, you guessed it, a poetic retelling of the book of Exodus, which features Moses as its heroic main character. Among other things, it narrates the crossing of the Red Sea and the destruction of Pharaoh's army. Tolkien worked with this poem a lot, editing and translating the entire text. That translation was published along with his lecture notes posthumously in 1982, and it would be the perfect book for me to recommend to you, but only 3,000 copies were ever printed. A new edition was recently released by HarperCollins, but you can only buy it in a box set that features 4 other books that, if you're like me, you already own. It's a little perplexing that HarperCollins would essentially gatekeep Tolkien's work on Exodus by forcing you to buy a $130 box set in order to read it. I can't help but feel that this will only serve to ensure that no one buys the book. It's a shame because it would have been the perfect option for anyone studying Exodus as a poem. To my knowledge, there is no accessible translation available, much less with a critical edition and commentary on the level of Tolkien's, to the general public. If you don't already own the 4 other books in the box set, I will have the link in the description because I do recommend all these books, but considering the fact that I've already bought them all, I personally will not be buying the set. I hope that HarperCollins releases the book as a standalone edition soon. Number 13. Cynewulf and Cyneheard. This is a prose, non-fiction account from the Chronicle of a blood feud between 2 important West Saxon figures, the king, Cynewulf, and the former king's brother, Cyneheard. It is a classic story. Cynewulf deposes and kills the wicked king, Siward, and takes the throne. Siward's brother, Cyneheard, whom Cynewulf unsuccessfully tried to exile, attempts to avenge his family by ambushing the king Cynewulf while he's seeing a woman. Cynewulf, the king, is outnumbered and is killed, but he dies fighting bravely, and his last action is to mortally wound Cyneheard. When the now dead king's men come to the scene, they all fight to the death in revenge. The mortally wounded Cyneheard and his men are initially successful, but when more of the king's men come, even though Cyneheard is mortally wounded, his men fight to the death in his defense. In the end, even though none of the figures involved really did anything dishonorable, basically everyone dies, and the story becomes even more impactful when we realize that it actually happened. Tolkien taught this story whenever he taught Old English prose, and anyone who's read the Silmarillion will be able to see very easily how much he was influenced by this sort of heroic honor code that many characters follow, often to their deaths. If you're interested in reading it, the Dumbarton Oaks edition of the Chronicle has a facing page translation, and the Old English text can be found on Peter Baker's website. Number 14. Ohthere and Wulfstan. This is from the Old English version of Orosius, which is a Christian history of the world and one of the most important texts in early medieval Europe. It was translated in the late 9th century in the court of King Alfred the Great, but the Old English version is less like a word-for-word translation and more like a new edition, which adds a lot of new material. One of the things it added was a description of the Arctic Circle and the White Sea by the Norwegian traveler Ohthere, as well as a description of the peoples of the Baltic Sea by a man named Wulfstan. What we get then is a fascinating insight into the political reality of 9th century Northern Europe, and the way that the educated elite of Wessex viewed their surroundings. Tolkien was probably interested in all the proper names being thrown around, and that's perhaps what he discussed with his students. He also likely appreciated the fact that the translator didn't just say, this tribe is here, this tribe is there. He gave it a narrative structure by saying, Ohthere said that this tribe is here. Wulfstan went and visited that tribe and said that this tribe is there. We see Tolkien mirror this artistic device early on in his Book of Lost Tales, told by a man named Alwine. Dumbarton Oaks has a translation of the Old English Orosius, which of course includes this section, in a facing page format. The Old English text is, you guessed it, available online, annotated in Peter Baker's Old English Anthology. Number 15. Sermolupi ad Anglos. The last text I'll cover today is a homily given by Wulfstan, Archbishop of York, and another staple of Tolkien's prose classes. Wulfstan was even crankier than Tolkien, and he did not have an optimistic view of 11th century Europe, which he thought was being punished by God for its sinfulness in the form of relentless attacks of pagan Vikings. Ironically, Wulfstan is actually mimicking the complaints of 6th century Welsh monk Gildas, who thought that the sinful Britons had been punished by God in the form of the pagan Anglo-Saxons. As far as I'm aware, Tolkien doesn't mention Wulfstan anywhere in his writings, and even though he lectured on it, this doesn't seem to be a very influential text for him. Hopefully one day his lecture notes on it will be made publicly available, but until that time it's safe to say that Tolkien probably appreciated the text as a bit of flowery prose, which tells us a lot about English society at the turn of the millennium. I spent a long time trying to find a good affordable translation to recommend today, until I realized that it's actually in the appendices of Liutz's Beowulf edition. I don't recommend Liutz's translation over Shippey's or Folk's, but I do think it's a good translation, and so if you're walking away from this video thinking that the only two interesting things were Beowulf and the Sermo Lupi ad Anglos, then just get Liutz's translation. And, if I even have to say it, the Old English text can be found online, annotated, on Peter Baker's excellent website, which is probably linked over 10 times at this point. And there you have it. Those are the 15 texts that Tolkien most frequently taught with his students while at Pembroke College in Oxford. Honorable mentions for works that he taught less frequently probably go to the Old English poems Elaine and Andreas, as well as the Old Norse poem Balthrstromar, and the Middle English romance King Horn. Tolkien loved Middle English, and once he moved to Merton, he taught it almost exclusively, but that's a topic for another video. Until then, I hope you've enjoyed this video on Tolkien's Old English reading list. If you enjoy this kind of content, be sure to check out the rest of the channel, kindly consider subscribing or becoming a supporter on Patreon, and until next time, Farath Ye Yisunde.